And so tonight we're going to be speaking with our astronomer, answers and genesis, Dr. Danny Faulkner. And so Danny, before we get into things, actually, the first question we can use as an introduction as well, because you did spend 26 years teaching at the University of South Carolina. And I guess the first question has to do with, how was it working at that university as a Christian, as a creationist, especially as an astronomer? Was it difficult, or was it, what was the situation like?
It was amazingly easy. I was very blessed in the situation that I was in. I was not at the main campus of the University of South Carolina. The main campus is in Columbia. It's a rather large school with probably 25,000, maybe more students. There are several other smaller campuses of the system throughout the state. I was in Lancaster. When I retired 7.5 years ago, we had close to 70 faculty and a couple of thousand students. Been a lot of growth. It was a smaller campus when I started there back in the mid 80s. And it's in a small southern town, Lancaster. Most of them probably never heard of it before. It's near Charlotte, North Carolina, across the state line. And it's in the deep South, which, if you don't understand anything about the history and geography of the United States, that is one of the most churched parts of the country. The county we lived in had plenty of churches everywhere. There were something like 56 Southern Baptist churches alone in the county, which is about 1 for every 1,000 people. So it's a very high ratio. And then there are Presbyterians and Methodists. And most people went to church in that community. People certainly in the upper crust of society. It was just one of those traditional things that you did. And I found that there were a fair number of devout Christian people, born again people in society. There are a lot of physicians, a couple of attorneys, believe it or not. And then on the university campus, we had several other faculty who were professing Christians, and staff members as well, and a number of students. Not to suggest that it was a Christian school by any means, but it was a sort of situation that was friendly, I should say, very much so to Christianity. In that town, you didn't have anything that went on Wednesday nights. You wouldn't have county or city council meetings. When my son was playing sports, soccer and so forth, we could practice and play games Monday and Tuesday and Thursday and Friday, but not Wednesday. That was the night people went to church. And so just everything closed down then. There were a few churches like our own that for years met on Thursday evenings. We were kind of odd. So occasionally my wife and I would go out shopping or dining on Wednesday, and I'd call it either Wednesday because the churchgoers weren't out there. 7 o'clock, they were gone. They were in the church pews. And whenever we had a meal on campus, we did a few times a year, different things, a luncheon of some sort, we would always begin in prayer. And if there was no pastor around, they would sometimes, ask me to do it because I was the closest thing to a pastor, even though I'm not ordained. Eventually, we got a math professor who was a very, very, very strong Christian man who happened to be ordained, and I lost the gig after that. When he was around, he always got the gig to pray for us. So I started there. I didn't advertise I was a creationist, but people knew I was a Christian. And soon after I started there, the word kind of got out that I was a Christian and a creationist as well. And the head of the honors program at the time thought that was a really cool thing, and he really was excited about it. We talked about it. We ended up doing an honors class back in the early 90s, twice on the question of creation evolution. I had 7 hour-and-a-half periods that I could bring in anybody I wanted and say anything I wanted. And so I took one of the meetings, but everybody else had guest speakers come in and speak for me. I had a paleontologist who's a creationist. I had a couple of biologists. I had a chemist. I had a lot of people coming in and giving presentations. It was a good situation all the way around. And eventually that man became the campus dean. He was the campus dean the last dozen years I was there. When my first book came out, it was back in 2004. It was on cosmology, the universe by design. I showed him a copy of the book, and immediately he first thing out words out of his mouth were let's do a book signing. So they arranged a book signing. They invited all the dignitaries in town. I got able to invite my own people as well. Had a great turnout, and I think I got the best introduction I had ever received on that evening from my campus dean. And he told me he got calls from people who were upset. Why are you having this creationist have a book signing on campus. He said he's a faculty member of mine. He published a book. I wished all my faculty members would publish a book. So he was very supportive of my work. He's not that he agreed necessarily. He was a philosophy professor, and he liked a good argument, and he recognized a good argument here. And when I retired, I wasn't running away from anything. I thoroughly enjoyed being there. If I did not have this calling and desire to be here at Answers in Genesis in Northern Kentucky, I could have easily spent the rest of my life there. I would still be there. In fact, it took a lot to drag me out of there. I was happy with my neighborhood, happy with my church, happy with my job. I just had a wonderful situation there. It was a big move for me to come up here, but this is what the Lord has for me and my wife at this time in our lives. I've maintained a good relationship since then on more than one occasion. Some people from outside tried to get me in trouble. One of these happened after I moved. A person from the UK, of all places, found out that I was claiming to be Distinguished Professor Emeritus. That's a title they give to retired professors at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster. And he contacted the campus dean, wanted to know, do you realize this guy is using your name as if he is? And they said, well, he is. What are you talking about? And the new dean at that time, who also, by the way, is a Christian man, a good friend of mine, he totally defended me. Earlier than that, a guy from somewhere else in the United States complained. I was still a professor there. His complaint went to the president in Columbia, and he sent it down the line and wanted to know what's going on here. And I wrote a 2-page explanation of what was going on. And I got a letter back from the president, basically clearing me. It was academic freedom, he said, and I don't agree with everything all my professors do, but there's no problem here. End of story. So the short answer, to give you the long answer, the short answer is academic freedom is alive and well at the University of South Carolina. And not all the stories in academia are like the ones you hear about in that DVD Expelled from about a decade ago. There are some good stories, and mine's one of them. So I'm very proud of the institution I taught at for years, and I really enjoy going back for a visit.
Do you think those week-long lectures had an influence on any of the students? Do you know if it challenged them in their thinking?
I think it did. In that evolution class, creation evolution class you're talking about, the honors class. What's interesting is there were a number of, many of the students are churched. They grew up in church. Not necessarily that they're born again people. Some of them are, some of them aren't. They just know the culture very well. And at the beginning one of the things you had to do is you had to write a paper at the end of the conclusion of the class on one side or the other. And most of it, we did a little survey going in and a survey going out. We found we didn't change many minds. However, one thing that stuck out at me was that going in to the class, these students, most of them, even the Christian folks, wanted to write their paper on evolution. Their reasoning was they thought it would be easier to get materials on that. But at the end of the conclusion of the class, many of those same people had changed their mind and wrote a paper about creation. And it's because we provided them with information and resources they didn't even know about. So it had a positive impact, even though you don't change too many minds. And, Simon, it's been my experience in these kind of things, debates and so forth, you don't change too many minds. People are dug in pretty deeply if they care enough to offend. You're just simply giving reasons to your own crowd, typically. I'm not a big fan of debates for that reason, because it's I just don't think you change too many minds with it.
Yeah, I guess people hear the other side of the debate.
Pardon?
I guess it gave people a chance to hear the other side of debate from at least a biblical perspective.
Yeah, I think debates are like they're like what we call in this country pep rallies. You come out and root for your side. But again, I have found they rarely change people's minds, because the people who will attend or will watch typically have their mind made up already. People who are sitting on the fence rarely go to those kind of events. When they do, of course, their minds can be changed. But I just don't think they accomplish as much as many people want them to seem to think that they accomplished.
Yeah. So a question that we have is, as an astronomer, I bet you get this all the time, is to do with UFOs. It's not only, I guess, outside in the culture with things like Star Trek and all the other sci-fi shows, but people have the questions in the church. What do we do with UFO sightings? Are they for real? Are they a prank? How should we view them as Christians?
Oh, do you all carry in the UK my pocket guide to UFOs and ETs? I think.
Yeah.
Okay, I thought you did. I wrote that about 5 years ago in conjunction, 4 years ago maybe, with conjunction with the planetarium show we premiered here about this. This is indeed a question I get quite a bit. And I've been studying the whole UFO phenomenon for off and on for a half century. It started up when I was actually in grade school. There were some waves of UFO sightings in the mid 60s I was in the midst of. And I read some of the things back then. Over the years, I've read different books and different sources trying to sort all of this out. And I'll give you the short version of this. After much of my study, I've become convinced that the vast majority of UFO sightings are misidentifications. There are all sorts of things out there that people really aren't used to seeing. I've been a student of the sky for a half century, and so I rarely see things in the sky that stump me. I've had a few, but most people couldn't tell you, they see an object in the sky, it's Venus, but they don't know that. They've never noticed it before, and it gets their attention. And sometimes people think that's moving, and so they think it's a flying saucer or something. Then there are a number of hoaxes, very famous hoaxes. Back in the UK, back in the 80s, I think it was, the big thing was crop circles. That started there in southern England and then spread around the world. That was a hoax. There are many, many other types of hoaxes. When you eliminate the misidentifications and the hoaxes, you're down to maybe 1 or 2% of sightings that defy explanation. Now, does it mean they don't have an explanation? Well, no. Does it mean automatically that if you can't explain it, it must be a flying saucer? And the answer is no. What it means is we haven't explained them yet. And now, also, I need to define what a UFO is. It's an unidentifying flying object. When I talk to people about these things, I ask them, well, have you seen a UFO? And a lot of people won't say yes. And I say, well, what's the matter with you? Aren't you paying attention? If you see things out there, if you look enough, you will see things you don't know what they are. If they're up in if you see something in the sky, it's obviously an object. If it's staying in the sky and isn't dropping like an anvil, then it's obviously flying. And if you don't know what it is, it's unidentified. You put that together, an unidentified flying object is UFO. Now, if you say it's a flying saucer, it's no longer a UFO. You've identified it. I think you've misidentified it, but you've still identified it as a flying saucer. A flying saucer cannot be an unidentified flying object. Many times I hear people use the term UFO when they really mean flying saucer. That happens all the time. And that's just looking at the evidence of what we see. There is no clear, I can see any clear evidence that we've ever been visited by extraterrestrials. Now, that raises up the question, do extraterrestrials exist? If so, could they come here? Those kind of questions. And the problem is we need to think about this biblically. We can't, we're Christians, we need to think about it biblically. If there's life elsewhere in the universe, then we know that God created it. We know biblically that only life comes from life, but we also know scientifically that's the case as well. It's called the law of biogenesis. Life just doesn't spontaneously arise. So based upon what I understand of Scripture and from good science, if life exists elsewhere, God made that life. Now, when I ask about ETs, I'm not talking about plant life and bacteria and cockroaches living on other planets. I'm talking about beings like you and like me, with a will, with an intellect, with the capacity to know God, all of these things. If they're lacking any of those things, then they aren't like us at all. Okay? So, did God make these? And if he made those, then a real good question arises. Well, are they in need of salvation? And if so, well, why would they be in need of salvation? And one possibility was because of Adam's sin, because we know that through the disobedience of one man, Adam, death came to all men. But we do also know through the disobedience of the obedience of the last Adam, Jesus Christ, all men can be made alive. So if it's through Adam's transgression, then Jesus' atonement on the cross on Calvary was sufficient to do that. So you got to realize something. If there are aliens, then to those aliens, we're the aliens. We're living on a different world. And so if you're trying to evangelize these beings or creatures or people on these other worlds, your salvation message might start something like this. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away. Well, obviously that sounds like science fiction because it is, and I don't think you get too many converts to that sort of thing. A raft of problems there, so that possibility doesn't work. Well, if these people are sinful, then maybe it's because when in their planet there was a Adam and Eve type character there as well, just like we had on Earth, and so they fell into sin, which then took their race into sin, hence requiring redemption. But that then would have not required that when Jesus finished his ministry here on the earth, he was born here, lived a perfect life, preached, laid down his life in atonement for sins, rose from the dead in victory over that in sin, and then ascended to go to another planet and do it again and again and again and again. But from the New Testament, we know that Jesus didn't do that. We know he went to sit at the right hand of the Father. For one thing, we have Stephen's witness in the book of Acts that he looked up and saw Jesus at the right hand of the Father. That may have only been weeks after the ascension. Certainly wasn't many years time at all. Also, we have other numerous passages in the New Testament tell us that Jesus is in heaven now. He's not interceding someplace or ministering on another planet. He's interceding for us in heaven. I do literally believe that Jesus died once for all. So if that's the case, then maybe these beings never entered into sin. Maybe they don't require salvation. But then on the other hand, we do know from Romans 8 that the entire creation is tainted by man's sin. And so we have these creatures who are living in a sin-tainted world, yet they themselves are not tainted by that sin. And that is a raft of philosophical and theological problems. So I think biblically, I'm arguing that we are alone in the universe. And I think scientifically we can argue that. I've written about this. We had a website article I've written a couple of times about the fact we have the Fermi paradox, the fact that if we're not alone in the universe, there should have been other civilizations ahead of us and they should have already colonized and we should see evidence. We don't see that. We've had the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, where we listen in on possible radio transmissions from other planets, other worlds outside the solar system. We have terabytes of data generated over the past half century or more, and no evidence of an intelligent signal anywhere yet. So again and again and again, we see evidence that we are alone in the universe, and we seem to be singing from the same page on this one. And we need to hasten. I'm not talking about spiritual beings such as angels. There are demons. They're in a totally different context. Now, there are some Christians who want to argue that UFO sightings are manifestations of demonic activity. When writing to the Corinthians, Paul talked about Satan sometimes taking on the appearance of light, and that would see these lights in the sky. That must be what's going on here. But I think perhaps they're giving too much credit here. And I've never been a real fan of UFO intervention being caused by demonic intervention. I think there are much more mundane, better explanations.
Yeah, and is the whole of alien life tied to evolutionary philosophy?
Oh, absolutely. You find the people out there who really expect and want and hope and just know that there's life elsewhere in the universe, almost to universally. They are committed to the naturalistic origin of life. And I think the reasoning is this. If life is unique to the Earth, then that makes the Earth very, very special. And if it's very special, that kind of drags you right back to creation, because then the question arises, well, what made us so special? Well, somebody made us special is the whole point. The assumption is that life is such that wherever the conditions are right, then life will develop naturalistically. Now, keep in mind that actually runs against what science tells us. Again, the law of biogenesis is pretty well established. Life only comes from living things, never from non-living. Yet people want to bend the rules or break the rules sometime in the past on Earth. But again, that would make the Earth special if unique to us. So they have to play the numbers game. They have to play the probabilities. They say, there are billions of galaxies and each one has billions of stars, and if only a tiny fraction have planets, only a tiny fraction of those had conditions right for life, and on and on and on and on. You still end up with millions of possible worlds out there with life on them. Well, Simon, over the past 2.5 decades, we discovered now more than 4,000 extrasolar planets. These are planets orbiting other stars, and not one of them is Earth-like. Sometimes there are claims, like once or twice a year, claim of a new Earth-like planet found out there. But whenever you do, it takes just a few minutes of me looking into it to find out several things wrong with each one of these to indicate that they're not places where life could exist. So you can go to our website and answersingenesis.org and find plenty of articles about these so-called Earth-like planets. They simply do not exist. That's another line of evidence suggesting that we are alone in the universe. But it's a good point you made there. The evolutionary worldview is a complete foundation, really, for believing that life is elsewhere.
We are taking Q&A tonight, so if you have any questions, please do put a comment in the comment section. I can see one has already come through from John. He says, I'm doing my master's degree in science through, I take that as the Open University, and I'm working on the space module at the moment. I have noticed that when studying the Lagrange orbits for the Gaia satellite mission, that when looking at the 5 Lagrange points, you can see the outline of the cross. Any thoughts on this? I'm also a church pastor with an interest in science and answering those who do not believe.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of people seeing crosses in nature. They had with what was that molecule, the lanolin molecule that had a little cross shape that got a lot of excitement a few years ago. Lagrangian points, there are 5. A guy named Lagrange investigated these a couple of centuries ago. When you have a large and a smaller body orbiting one another, such as with the Earth orbiting around the sun, you end up with 5 locations in the orbit that are stable. A third object thrown into the mix will tend to have a chaotic motion. It will be yanked around by orbiting the big one, but it will be yanked around by the smaller one. And so these things will kind of collect naturally in stable positions called the Lagrangian points. And there's an L1, L2, L3, L4, and L5. And they like to stick certain satellites there. The Gaia satellite is one that's looking for very precise measurements of stars' positions for getting parallax and other things. And that's been put in one of the Lagrangian positions. But I wouldn't want to read too much spirituality into, the fact that they do have kind of a cross pattern. You find that quite a bit. I mean, if things are not collinear in a long line, they are going to intersect, in which case it looks like a cross. But maybe you're seeing something that really isn't there.
Yeah. Hope that helps, John. If you are studying your master's degree in science, some of Danny's books that we do at the ministry might help you with that. So it's worth going online and checking some of those out. We can put some links there in the comment section afterwards. But a question we often receive, Danny, has to do with the argument that creation basically is the God of the gaps argument. When we don't have an answer for something, we basically, atheists all claim that we just say, well, God did it. And so we don't have to look at science. We just get away with things by saying God did it. Is creation a God of the gaps argument?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, the original God of the gaps argument was that thousands of years ago, people didn't know any better. So when they heard thunder, saw lightning, they saw wind, anything that happened, it was attributed to some sort of spirits or gods. And then as people learned more, they realized that lightning was a natural phenomenon and thunder was a consequence of that. And so God wasn't necessarily to be invoked in this, and went, pushing back the boundaries farther and farther and farther. And it looked like God was kind of shrinking off into the distance. But there are certain imponderables out there that cannot be explained. One of them is the origin of life. The naturalistic origin of life is contrary to everything we know about where life comes from. I can't say that enough. And yet people want to believe that. They want to separate biological evolution from that question of the origin of life. And I get that. But I think the reason being is because they don't have a very good answer for that. And so I've kind of taken from time to time when evolutionists, not just biological evolution, but stellar evolution and other things, they invoke what I call an evolution of the gaps. There are certain things that they can't understand, they can't explain, and they simply have to attribute it to something that maybe one day might be explained, but they don't know yet. To me, it's the same sort of argument. And I think that with almost any system, you have a few things that you don't have answers for. To people within that system, it's going to look perfectly reasonable and quite probable and likely to them, quite plausible. But to people from outside, they're going to point at those flaws and those problems and say, well, don't you have a problem here you can't answer it? Or aren't you invoking something that's beyond what you know? So again, there's an evolution of the gaps, I think, that's going on there as well.
So rather than the together the gaps argument, evolutionists, we do see them try and get out of things by just saying, well, evolution did it.
Yeah, evolution did it, or in the case of astronomy, many times it's just a series of random events that all seem to line up. You know, in solar system formation, for instance, you have to explain a number of anomalies, and every one of them is explained just about in terms of a collision. You know, a planet's forming, and then a big body comes along and hits it and changes something. Well, another body needs explanation. A big body came in and hit it and changed something, and on and on and on it goes. They invoke all sorts of things without any evidence that it actually ever happened. When they get done, it had to happen because otherwise we wouldn't be here, is a sort of argument. How many times have you heard of evolution say that? You know, you really give some good arguments against evolution, and they get exasperated sometimes, said, well, it must have happened because we're here, aren't we? And I mean, I heard about that and thought it was pretty funny, and didn't think anybody actually said that until I actually heard a few people say that when I was talking to them. So yeah, evolutionists of all types actually invoke the same sort of argument at some point.
Yeah, they try and personify evolution by saying evolution did it, therefore
this and does that. Yeah.
I guess which leads us to another question, which is quite a famous response from leading atheist evolutionary scientists like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Lawrence Krauss, when a number of times they make comments such as, we come from stardust. I mean, as an astronomer, you must have heard these comments before. Why do they say that, and how would we rebut that argument as Christians?
Yeah, the first person I heard say that actually was the late Carl Sagan, more than 40 years ago. He was fond of saying that, and I think they're picking up what he said. If he was the first, I don't know, but that's the first I remember hearing about it. I guess evolutionists would say in the beginning there was hydrogen. You know, they everything starts with hydrogen because the Big Bang happens, and it's mostly hydrogen, a little bit of helium, and a trifling amount of lithium. We look around us, and there's a lot more than that. You know, I see in my hands, I've got the oxygen and carbon and nitrogen in my flesh and in my organs, in my bones. There's calcium. We have all these, in my blood, I have iron. None of these are primordial, according to the ultimate evolutionary theory, the Big Bang theory. So where did all these come from? Well, the belief is that stars get their energy by nuclear fusion. The sun, for instance, we have good evidence, by the way, now that this is actually happening. The sun in its core is fusing hydrogen into helium, building up more and more helium at the expense of hydrogen. And then they've worked out pathways of where heavier elements can be fused, typically in the late stages of what we call stellar evolution. You can fuse heavier elements into carbon, and beyond carbon into heavy elements up to iron. And then in certain events like supernovae explosion, you can generate other heavier elements beyond that. So there's a very elaborate theory that astronomers have worked out over the past half century plus, explaining where the carbon in your blood came from, where the calcium in your bones came from, or the carbon and nitrogen and oxygen in your bodies came from, or the aluminum in your some of the things we use, like soda cans, and the silicon inside my cell phone comes, from all of these different things. The idea is that stars are born, they go through their cycles, and in the process of blowing up or spewing their innards back into space, they generate heavier elements, which then mix with what's there. Another generation of stars form, and another generation of stars form. And the process repeats and repeats, and over billions of years, you end up build up of these heavier elements. You see, the argument is that the universe was around for 9 billion years before the Earth and the rest of the solar system came into being 4.5 billion years ago. So when the Earth forms from the dust inside of that dust cloud, you get a lot of iron and silicates and oxygen and so forth that form. None of those things were coming from the Big Bang. They were fused inside of stars. And so you have to thank your lucky stars that stars created the material that existed in you. And Lawrence Krauss, I think probably the reason why you mentioned him is there's this famous quote there where he was saying that, and this is one of the most poetic things he's aware of, and he says it's likely that the the elements in your left hand and your right hand came from two different sources. And then he went on, and this is blasphemous, but I'll have to quote him here. He said, "Forget Jesus, the stars died for you, so that you would be here." And it's become kind of a secular religion. It's one of naturalism, where there is no God necessary. We can come up with ideas and theories about how the universe may have come to being and how it evolved and how it changed and where the elemental things that put us together came from. That is what they're talking about when they say we came from stardust.
Yeah. Have you ever had any interaction with Lawrence Krauss as an astronomer?
No, I never have. I've never been to a meeting where I saw him. We probably were at a couple of meetings. I go to the American Astronomical Society meetings from time to time, and he likely was there. I didn't recognize him, didn't notice him. Our paths have just never crossed before.
Yeah. I mean, you talked about the birth of the stars, and I've heard some evolutionists try to say we've seen stars forming in the universe and the galaxy. Have we ever seen stars forming?
No. For one thing, the process is very slow in terms of human terms. I mean, a star even a massive star would take thousands and thousands of years to form. A less massive star would take millions of years to form. So it's a very slow, gradual process. But yet, from time to time, you get these news reports that say, astronomers have observed the birth of a star. If you're hearing that, you would think, well, like last week they looked there and the star wasn't there, and then this week it was. And that's not what's going on at all. Astronomers have snapshots of all these different stars in different parts of the sky doing different things. And they've arranged these snapshots in kind of a progression, an order of the way they think it ought to be. They think they know what a forming star would look like. So when they see an object that kind of conforms to their expectations, they then tag that as a star being caught in birth or recently born. But again, you really can't say that for certain. You could interpret the observations a number of ways. They've simply interpreted it one way, and they're convinced that that's the only way to interpret it. Now, having said that, I'm a student of history, and scientific history is also a keen interest of mine, or history of science, I should say. And there are numerous examples of ideas that were once held to be absolutely certain that eventually were discarded. Relevant to this was over 100 years ago, people took drawings and photographs, pretty new back then, but photographs, the first of the Andromeda, what they called then the Andromeda Nebula. Today we call it the Andromeda Galaxy. I think the first good photograph was done in the 1880s. And it's got this round sort of shape, kind of like a disc. It's edge on, so it's kind of oval shape. It's got a bulge in the middle. And they said, you know what? Our theory of how the solar system formed is that you had a gas cloud that contracted down. Most of the material fell towards the center, become the sun, and then the remainder of the material flattened out to form a disk, and out of that disk formed all these planets. By the way, that's basically the theory we still have today after more than a century. It's been just dressed up a bit and changed a little bit, but the basic concept is still the same. And so when they looked out and saw this object in space, they said, aha, this is a solar system in the forming. The nucleus down inside, it was much brighter than the rest of this object. That was the sun that was forming. And you could see that debris disk out of which eventually planets would form. Well, it's quite a shock in 1924 when Edwin Hubble demonstrated that this was not a nearby cloud of gas and dust forming a solar system. Instead, it was an entire galaxy of a few hundred billion stars considerable distance away from us. What they thought they were seeing at the middle was not a single star forming, but was rather a bulge of many millions of stars, about 10,000 light years across. Why I mention this is the fact that this was an evidence given 100 years ago of a star being born, a solar system, a planetary system being born. Today, no one believes that. No one's believed it for almost close to a century now. So how can we be so certain that when we interpret these snapshots, as it were, of stars or other objects at various stages, that they are indeed the stages we assign to those in terms of evolutionary model? The same mistake could be being made all over again.
And another question we had, I guess that's related to the stars, has to do with the Great Pyramids in Egypt, and you may have heard of this one before, Danny. Do we know, are the Great Pyramids astronomically aligned to the constellation Orion? Is that true?
I don't think so. This whole thing got started in the 1980s. The name most commonly attached to it is Graham Hancock. He wrote some books about this and hit the lecture circuit quite a bit. I've heard him on radio shows before. Though he did not invent this whole thing, he's written more than anybody on it. And the argument is, you get these three Greek big pyramids. You got the two really big ones there in Egypt, and then a short distance away you got a third one, and they almost make a line. They're not exactly lined up, but they're also not lined up with each other. I mean, they've got the square base, and like one is here and one is here and one is over here. They're not tilted like this. They line up, so they're tilted at a certain angle. And the argument was that if you look at that, if you get the orientation this direction by the size of the pyramids, and then you take the orientation like this and try to overlay them to the three stars in the belt of Orion, you get a good match. And I've seen the diagrams. The match is reasonably good, but it's not perfect by a long shot. And even if it was meant to do that, there isn't a historical record of that, but even if it was meant to do that, what's the point? Why did they do it? And that's where Graham Hancock and others have created an entire scenario. Their argument is that the pyramids were built like 12,000 years ago, which is about 7,000 years earlier than generally thought. I think they're dated from the third millennium BC by conventional dating. I'd make them a little younger than that, actually, but a very ancient civilization. And the argument is that there was a very ancient civilization 12, 15,000 years ago, very advanced, had a lot of astronomy, built these structures, and then the civilization disappeared. Disaster, who knows what happened. And then civilization comes back again. The Egyptians build theirs around these, but they don't have a clue what's going on there. It's entirely conjecture. And when I first heard about it, I thought it overlapped with alien astronauts quite a bit. I think that they're trying to explain some of the same things in a fantastic way that the alien astronauts, or ancient alien astronauts, is trying to explain as well. So it's fantasy, it's conjecture, but I've not seen anything in it that I thought was compelling at all.
Yeah, so we shouldn't use that argument. And I guess what people see is the great grand design of the pyramids, the intelligence that goes into them. In fact, I noticed, I think it was yesterday on the BBC over here, they had an article, Who Made the Pyramids? And they were trying to say it was time travelers or something, which was, if you're going to guess at something, well, there you go. But when we see things like that, what does it tell us about ancient civilizations?
Well, what's interesting is that everyone focused on those two or three large pyramids there in Giza in Egypt. But many people don't realize that there are hundreds of pyramids all over Egypt. They're pretty common. And actually, pyramids are common around the world. I've seen some pyramids in Central America, Mexico. They had pyramids there. And there's early culture seemed to do that. Why were they doing it? Well, I'll come back to that maybe in a minute here if I remember to come back to it. But what's fascinating is that the oldest pyramids in Egypt are those two or three big ones. They're big, they're grand, they're built out of block, they're not built out of brick, they're quarried stone that were placed very meticulously. And if you follow dynasty after dynasty after dynasty after that, you will find that two things happen. First of all, the pyramids get smaller and their construction gets worse. Later, eventually, they were making their pyramids out of mud brick, and today they're just simply piles. They're just a little hill because the rain has taken their toll on them. Not like the rock. The rock's pretty impervious to that, but man-made structures don't fare so well. And this is a pattern we see playing out around the world where civilization blows onto the scene. Happened in Central America, for instance. The grandest, biggest, and greatest structures like those pyramids came in the earliest dynasties. And then you had just this withering away after that. It suggests that early civilization was very, very advanced to some level. And then eroded away. The evolutionary viewpoint is that man started off very primitive. They're hunters and gatherers. Eventually, 12,000 years ago, they began collecting in a few places, discovered animal husbandry and a few crops. They could settle down, which gave them more free time. They began to do more, began to do arts and crafts, began to build structures. And gradually, the population grew. Government became necessary. Government evolved, and on and on and on it goes. It's a very gradual buildup from very humble beginnings up to what we have today. And if you look over the past 500 years, well, that's pretty believable almost, because we have seen a tremendous advance in technology over the past half millennium. You got to realize that the Great Pyramid of Egypt, 500 feet high, was not eclipsed in size until the late Middle Ages, almost modern times. People that weren't able to match that structure once again. So if you look at the fact, not the theory, you look at the fact. If you plot up, technological advancements, you have a tremendous amount of achievement early on, and then it declines away. I'm doing that backwards. Tremendous amount of achievement starting up, it declines away, and then it starts rising in recent centuries again. That's what the evidence says. Most people don't want to come to grips with that, but that's what it has. A tremendous amount of advancement early on. Maybe not like today, but certainly better than anything that followed over the next 3,000 or 4,000 years. Now, what do we find when we turn to Scripture? Well, we find that we have just a few generations after Adam, you have people who are working in various types of metals. We have people with different types of music, all sorts of husbandry, growing crops and animals. There wasn't this long period of figuring out things out and going from being hunters and gatherers. We find in Genesis civilization from the get-go. We find that Cain departed, went east to the land of Nod, and there built a city. We have a city in the next generation after Adam, with overlapping, of course, with his lifetime tremendously. There were people being born. There were cities rising up. There were civilizations out there. And you then have the flood that takes place. And after that, there was even a vestige of that. But when you look after the flood, the lifetimes of people began to decline pretty rapidly. So by the time you get down to Abraham, being 90 years old is something. A few generations before, 9 years old, you were still just reaching your stride at that point. People lived for hundreds of years. And I think that loss of longevity speaks about how virile and how strong people are physically, and also probably about their mental capabilities. And if you had this institutional learning that went on for centuries after centuries, I think you could accomplish a lot more. I'm amazed at my ripe old age of 65. There's a lot of stuff I didn't know when I was younger. And it took me a lifetime to get to where I am. And if I lived for, let's say, 450 years, how much more would I know and could I accomplish? That ain't going to happen, though, because I have a sense of my own mortality. I'm approaching that 70 plus maybe a little bit pretty quickly. But I think the facts of history and archaeology, early history and archaeology, really are consistent with what Scripture tells us, and not at all consistent with the evolutionary model.
Yeah. Well, we've got a lot of eternity to do some more learning and catching up, Danny.
Yeah.
Just to remind folks who are watching, if you have any questions on the Bible and science for Danny, then please do type it into the comments section, and we'll try and get to them. Just on ancient objects, I know you've been to the UK and been to Southern Ireland. You have been to Southern Ireland, haven't you? Did you speak there at the conference, or you went there, didn't you?
In Belfast, but then that was 2.5 years ago. But then I think 2.5 years ago. But then we spent a week vacationing in Ireland, so we saw a lot of sights. I went to Newgrange there in Ireland, and then a trip to a couple of years ago to the Midlands. We made it down to Bristol over vacationing, and Stuart Burgess was kind enough to take us to Stonehenge, which of course I always wanted to see. Stonehenge is a cool place. It really is. So you have a lot of old structures there. Were you going to mention Stonehenge or Newgrange?
You read my mind. You read my mind. Do you have any thoughts on those astronomically?
We don't know the purpose of either one of those structures. Have you been to Newgrange, by the way, Simon? You've probably been to Stonehenge, but maybe not.
Yeah.
Newgrange is even older, we believe. We don't know what their purpose was. We see astronomical alignment, but we don't know. The people who built it left no records. And so we can only surmise what it was for. People have suggested that it was an observatory. There's a theory put forth back in the 70s, I guess, about a very elaborate theory about the post holes and how you can drop stones around and keep track of like moving clock hands of months and so forth. Interesting theory, but did they really have that? We don't know. Were the alignments coincidental? Probably not. At New Grange, that we believe that the passage there aligned with the rising sun at the time of the December solstice, and don't know for sure what that meant. I'm of the opinion that these people, it was probably a religious observance. There was a lot of idolatry, people worshiping the heavens and things in the sky. So if you're going to do that, I think having a temple, as it were, some other shrine that would be a place you could celebrate the equinoxes and solstices and so forth would make a lot of sense. So I think that's probably what they were, with a strong astronomical connection to it, more of a temple sort of thing, religious ceremony rather than astronomical science going on per se. You had to have the science in order to build this, but not much science went on after that, I don't think.
Yeah. I know today they're still used for sort of pagan festivals, religious things at the summer solstice.
Neo-pagan. These are people in the 20th and now 21st century who try to revive these ancient religions. They have no connection. They're just making this up. I don't know why in the world the government gives them special treatment. They allow them to get on the grounds and walk around where people normally can't go. Well, I'm an astronomer. Why can't I go there? It's discrimination at this point. If these people had really a lineage that went way back, that might be one thing. But these people are neo-pagans. They're not true pagans in that sense. They don't share any lineage with the people of the past.
Yeah. So do we have much historical records? I mean, if things like Stonehenge and New Grange weren't built for astronomy purposes, are there any ancient sites that were built for that purpose?
Probably. I mean, you had to figure out this stuff to start with. They didn't just go monkeying around there at Stonehenge and put this in. They already had to know certain things. They had to know which direction things were, which direction the rising or sun on certain dates were going to be. And that information probably was done with very temporary structures. The first thing you can do is set a level plane up, put a vertical pole. It could be made out of wood if you wanted to, and then simply mark the shadow into the shadow at various times throughout the day, and that will fix your north-south line. You simply wait until the north-facing shadow in the northern hemisphere is as short as possible. That will tell you which way north is. And then if you do that every day around noon along that line, you can figure out when the solstices are. It's when they have the longest and shortest shadows at noon. And then from there, you can figure out which direction east and west are, and which direction the earliest sunrise, latest sunrise, earliest sunset, latest sunset, and so forth. It takes a temporary structure to build that. I don't think I'd want to haul all those stones, 100 miles, huge as they are, and put them in place the first time I'm doing this, because you're probably not going to get it right. You do it with a temporary structure until you get it all right, and then you bring in the stones. Well, if you're going to bring in the stones, why bring them in at all? Because you already have the information. That's why I think these things were built not for the observations themselves, but to do something to build on those observations. Again, most likely religious observations. Religious practices. There are ancient observatories around the world, but almost all of them indicate some sort of knowledge already there. There are various wheels and circles in the United Kingdom. Scotland has a bunch of them, and there are wheels in this country as well. One famous one's called the Medicine Wheel in Wyoming. I've not seen it, but it's a very crude, much more crude junior version of Stonehenge.
Yeah, you do see some of the mentions of star signs in Job, for example, don't we? So from a biblical point of view, obviously we could say, well, it was God giving Job the information, but did people have an awareness back then of the different constellations?
Well, we don't know. The constellations we have date back to the Greeks. There's a book written almost two millennia ago, early second century AD. Claudius Ptolemy wrote this book we call the Almagest today, where he describes the 48 classic constellations. But there's excellent evidence in that the constellations were already 2,000 years old by the time he came along. The best evidence is that they were codified probably around the middle of the third millennium BC, which coincidentally coincides pretty well with the date of the flood and the first post-flood civilization there at the Tower of Babel. I think that this information existed at that point, was carried around the world already. So yeah, I think knowledge goes way, way back, even among supposedly primitive societies. We have nothing in North America, in the United States, anything like the ancient societies in Europe or the Middle East. Yet these people built circles as well. They had pretty good astronomical knowledge. Later on, you had the Incas and the Aztecs in South and Central America, who built some elaborate structures based upon certain alignments. But I think a lot of their astronomy was probably not as well advanced as the so-called primitives with the crude stone wheels. The one exception would be the Mayan civilization. It flourished around 1,000 years ago, and that one had a remarkable thing. It was the only Western Native American civilization that had a written language, and they had an extensive calendar. You may have heard about, remember the 2012 end of the world sort of calendar. It was misunderstood, but they understood a thing called the Saros cycle that was known in the ancient world quite a bit. It was independently discovered by different civilizations, including the Mayans. They had the most sophisticated sort of astronomy than anybody in the New World, at least.
Yeah, so all it proves really is the further we go back in history, people were intelligent. They weren't, in the evolutionary mindset, I guess, stupid, but we see intelligence early on in civilization.
Yeah, the more I learn about some of the things that were conclusions reached, thoughts, things they did, the more impressed I am with some of those people. We have the advantage of building on a huge foundation. When the scientific revolution took place 4 centuries ago, things really began to take off at an accelerated pace. But without that foundation, we wouldn't be enjoying the fruits of that. It took a certain time to get to that. And when that happened, it opened us plenty of doors. But again, the assumption of evolution and the way society developed and science developed and technology developed really flies in the face of the facts.
Yeah. Have you ever looked into, I mean, if you look at the time of the 16th century where science really flourishes, it flourishes at the time of the Reformation. And so obviously there's a worldview behind it there. But why didn't science, we know the Chinese were inventing things and other civilizations. Why do you think science didn't come out of the East, but it came out of the West?
Well, the Chinese were very interesting. They invented gunpowder, but did nothing with it. They invented paper, but did nothing with it. They invented the printing press, but did nothing with it. They had these great ideas that just suddenly stopped. And that's fascinating. There's something different about the European mind. That's not racist. It's not bigoted. It's just a statement of fact that there's a certain worldview that they did not share. Now, where did those worldviews come from? Well, it comes from your culture, and don't forget the word culture and the word cult have a common root there. Your culture is intimately related to your religious beliefs, your theistic beliefs. Do you believe in God? If so, who is he, or what or is he, and so forth. And in the Far East, there was belief in yin and yang. There was belief in a lot of chance. You didn't really have much reason to see any kind of patterns in nature because things were continually changing and developing and just stochastically or randomly taking place. In the West, it was a little different. Early on, you had paganism, where they had a polytheism and their gods were not very powerful, couldn't create much of anything. And again, they kind of toyed around with the idea of a world that's continually in flux. One of the famous Greek philosophers, and the philosophy people get upset at me at this point because I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but the one that said a man never steps in the same river twice. You have continual flux. You get rocks moving around and water flowing, and so everything is in this state of flux and continually changing. And this persisted, this kind of thinking persisted well into the Christian era. Once once Christianity became established in the West, it became entangled with Western thought. But things slowly developed in the Middle Ages. A few people here and there who were doing some really cool things. But as you pointed out, things really began to gel 400 years ago, right after the Protestant Reformation, and science really exploded in Northern Europe, particularly in England. I mean, it's incredible. In the 1600s, the number of people you folks had, a relatively small country, but yet you produced giants as Newton and Halley and I think Boyle lived at that time, Christopher Wren, it goes on and on, all these people, Robert Hooke, these people. Why England? Why there? And even some atheists have commented on the worldview and the effect that Christianity had upon it. In biblical worldview, the world was created by God, and God is a God of order. He's a God of decrees. And we know from the New Testament that he upholds and sustains the world moment by moment by the power of his word. It's Colossians 1 and Hebrews 1. So if God is a God of order and a God of decrees, and if he's sustaining the world, maybe, just maybe, as a working hypothesis, you could say that God has imparted some of that consistency he has, some of those decrees up on the world. And so instead of there being this yin and yang and a bunch of random events taking place, maybe there's a fundamental pattern that's going on in nature around us. And that fundamental pattern is the thing that way God has ordained that the world will operate. And so when you do that, you begin to look at this thesis that maybe it's the way to look at the world. And when you do that and begin to experiment, you begin to find out that thesis is very good, very strong, because there's powerful evidence to see that pattern. This led to then Newton's laws of motion and other things like this. In fact, this whole idea of a law comes from that. God is the ultimate lawgiver. And so he imposed order onto the creation. And when we discover a law of the world, we're basically looking at God's law that he imposed upon the world. And only that could come out of a Christian worldview. And it took centuries of that to really overturn the ancient pagan beliefs that were there. Now, the other little key point was Protestant. And what had happened in the ancient Greek world, the Greeks separated between the heavenly realm and the earthly realm. Things in the heavens were followed one set of rules. Things on the earth followed a different set of rules. Aristotle was very clear about that. And so this was adopted by the Roman Catholic Church. They said that, look, people who are working on heavenly things, and that would be the priest and the king, are doing things that are a higher calling. Everybody else, if you're a farmer, if whatever you are, you're dealing with the terrestrial realm, the worldly realm, and it's going to be burned up. It's not significant. And so consequently, there's a big division, not only between the two physically, but also spiritually, that certain people had higher occupations than others. The Protestant Reformation comes along and it tears down that barrier and says, no, there is no separation between the secular and the sacred. Turns out that was a Greek import anyway, pagan Greek import. It was not a Christian ideal. And one of the lessons coming out of the Protestant Reformation was, if you are a farmer and you are called to be a farmer, then you should do that in the glory of God, and your work can be just as honoring to God, because it's good, honest work. If it is good, honest work, is just as important in God's sight as the priest and the king would be as well. And this gave rise to what we call the Protestant work ethic. I heard that term growing up, and I never knew what it meant until many years later. As an adult, I finally figured it out. It doesn't mean that Catholics are sloven. They don't work very hard. That's not it at all. It means that Protestants had a special reason for working hard. Roman Catholics, they have a good reason for working too. Don't get me wrong. But Protestants are doing it not just for themselves, but they're doing it for God's glory as well. And this had ramifications everywhere. You see, the world was no longer this, around us was no longer this physical thing that had no worth and dignity. It was a tainted creation, tainted by man's sin, but it also was part of God's creation and reflected his glory nevertheless. So consequently, it was an honoring thing, a God-honoring thing, and a worshipful thing to study the world around us. And I think that's the reason why Protestant Europe suddenly led the scientific revolution. And for about 100 years, it was very much in the forefront that. It got hijacked in the next century, in the 18th century, 1700s. Atheists and agnostics and other people began to hijack science and make it into something that it was not originally.
Yeah. Someone's asked the question, can you recommend any books on the flourishing of science during the time of the Reformation?
Oh boy, I don't know of a book, a single book out there. I've read a number of different sources. There are articles and such, but I'm sorry, I cannot recommend a book. I just don't know of one.
Here's one where my knowledge will come in. I said, here's one where my knowledge will come in handy.
Okay, yeah.
Joyty is the person who's asked the question. Joyty, if you look up Rodney Stark, For the Glory of God, how I think it's how monotheism led to Reformation, science, and witch hunts. That's Rodney Stark, For the Glory of God. And Rodney Stark, I think, is an agnostic, but he's a professor of social sciences somewhere in the US. But also there's another historian who's an atheist, actually, called Peter Harrison. I think he's at Cambridge University. And if you look up Peter Harrison and the Reformation and science, he's written 2 books that are really helpful. And although he's an atheist, he's pretty honest with his conclusions. So that's Rodney Stark and Peter Harrison.
Well, thank you. I'm not aware of those 2 books, but I'm not surprised that they're not Christian. This whole argument that Christianity made and Protestant Christianity made science possible actually was been argued by a number of atheists and agnostics. There's another name from the 19th century or early 20th century that's escaping me right now, but he made the same argument. He's not even a Christian. So it's not just we creationists who are claiming this argument. We're actually agreeing with what atheists have already written on this point.
Yeah, that's the good point. It's atheist or agnostic historians who are telling us this information. So it's not fundamentalist Bible believing Christians who are trying to promote this. But if you look at history is clear that science developed in the Western world. And maybe we can end on this point, Danny. If science, since science flourished under a Christian worldview in the 16th century, then you talked about agnostic and atheistic sciences taken over in the 17th century. Now we're in the 21st century. What will happen to science if we remove that Christian worldview? Will it start to diminish, or what will be the effect?
Well, I'm convinced it will. I mean, we're riding on a lot of momentum right now, but the philosophical basis is completely wrong. And we've been seeing it for decades, a rise of Oriental mysticism all over again. You know, J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was the guy who oversaw the scientist who really made the Manhattan Project, the invention of the atomic bomb, take place. He was quite fond of quoting from Indian mystical literature, religious literature there. And there has been the Tao of Physics has been written. There have been many people who are looking to the East and seeing there the future of science. And I think that's a fundamental mistake. You're going to a worldview that doesn't provide the foundation for science, and I think ultimately is contradictory to science. If it just comes down to randomness, then there is no order, there is no pattern. So it will take time, but I do believe that if science continues to develop in the way it has been going, it will not be good. It will lead to very bad ideas and eventually undercut itself.
Yeah. This is why we need more young people who are Christians to get involved with science and get out there into the academy and start speaking up and, start bringing a new revolution about in science. But we do appreciate the work of yourself, Danny, and many other Christian scientists who are out there leading the way. If you haven't read Danny's books already, I don't know if you've got them with you there tonight, Danny, Created Cosmos and The Expanse of Heaven. We'll put those in the comment section, but I'd recommend that you try and get hold of those books, and those books will help you. There they are. Danny's modeling them there for you, The Expanse of Heaven and The Created Cosmos. We're doing a special deal on those actually at the moment, but we do have 20% off our resources. Get those books into your hands and to the hands of maybe younger people who might be going off to university to do science, because those books will really help you. And you can find a ton of other resources at answersandgenesis.org. So Danny, thanks for your time tonight. I know people are commenting they've been blessed by watching, so we appreciate you being with us.
Thank you.